The portrait on the wall is a lie. The soft-spoken First Lady, the grinning president, the power couple who held America's hand through Depression and World War. That image belongs on a postage stamp, not in a history book, because the marriage behind it froze solid before its first decade was out and never thawed again. A husband kept a mistress from the wedding bed to the deathbed. A mother-in-law told the grandchildren to their faces that they belonged to her. The wife, starved of every kind of warmth a marriage is supposed to provide, learned to love other people, in other rooms, in other ways, because the man sitting across the table could not love her back. By the end, the famous couple could barely share a table without a wall of ice between them. And here is the part that textbooks never print. That marriage was supposed to erase Eleanor Roosevelt. Instead, it built her into the most powerful woman the country ever produced. United Nations delegate, national conscience, recipient by the thousand of strangers' private grief. The institution that tried to silence her handed her, instead, a stage tall enough to stand on. The story of how that happened begins with a wedding, because the wedding tells you everything you need to know about the two people walking into it and the two forces waiting on the other side of the door. The day was March 17th, 1905, St. Patrick's Day in New York City, the streets choked with parade crowds and green bunting and the kind of cheerful chaos that swallows a bride and groom without trying. The bride's uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt, agreed to give her away. He was the most famous human being in America at that moment, and his presence that afternoon was not a gift to his niece so much as a convenience to himself. The parade cover let the president ride to the ceremony and back again without anyone asking why he bothered to attend. He came, he walked his niece down the aisle, he handed her to Franklin, and then, because Teddy Roosevelt owned every room he ever entered, he owned this one too. The guests peeled away from the newlyweds and swarmed the president. He held court in the library of the House, cracking jokes, shaking hands, drawing every eye and every ear in the building. The bride and groom stood ignored at their own reception. Franklin Delano Roosevelt spent his wedding day as a footnote to his wife's uncle, and Eleanor absorbed a lesson she would be forced to relearn in one form or another for 40 years. In this family, someone else always swallowed the spotlight. It would never be her. The two people at the altar that afternoon were neither of them whole, and neither of them knew it yet. Eleanor walked in as an orphan inside one of the wealthiest families in America. Her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt, had been one of the great society beauties of her generation, a woman whose name opened every drawing room on the Hudson. She looked at her serious, plain, large-toothed daughter and nicknamed her, to her face, Granny. By the time Eleanor turned 10, both her parents lay in the ground. Her father, Elliot, had been a charming alcoholic who adored his daughter from a polite distance and drank himself under it. Eleanor was shipped, in the aftermath, to a grandmother's house run with all the warmth and color of a mausoleum. She learned early, and learned deep, that the world did not owe her comfort, and that the safest thing to do with a hungry heart was to fold it small and hide it. Franklin walked in as the adored only son of Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who treated him less like a child and more like a son around which she arranged the rest of her life. She had breastfed him until he could nearly walk. She had dressed him in skirts and long curls well past the age of protest. She kept a diary of his bowel movements. None of this embarrassed her. She had decided, somewhere in the first months of his life, that no force on earth, and certainly no wife, would ever come between her and her boy. When Franklin enrolled at Harvard, Sarah did not weep and let go. She rented a house in Boston and stayed near him. When he fell in love with Eleanor and courted her in secret for more than a year, Sarah tried to strangle the romance by shipping Franklin off on a Caribbean cruise, betting that distance and other women would cool him down. The bet failed. Franklin proposed. Eleanor accepted. Sarah, beaten on that front, did what Sarah always did when she lost a battle. She changed the terms. If she could not stop the marriage, she would own it. The houses, the money, the children, and as much of her son as any wife would ever be permitted to touch. Look at the geometry of what that wedding set in motion. A young woman raised to believe she deserved nothing, marrying a young man raised to believe he deserved everything, with his mother holding the checkbook, the deed to the house, and the keys to her son's heart. Eleanor entered starving for a family that would, finally, want her. Sarah entered determined to keep the only person she ever wanted to keep. Those two hungers could not coexist under one roof. They could not even share a city block without a war, and only one of those women controlled the money. The other one would spend the next 40 years learning what it felt like to smile through dinner in a house she could not call her own. That is the marriage the history books skip past in a single sentence. A love match between a fifth cousin and a charming young Harvard man, blessed by the President of the United States, sealed on a St. Patrick's Day afternoon in New York. The truth behind this sentence is colder and stranger. The marriage did not start cold. It was frozen, deliberately, by the woman in the next room, and it stayed frozen long after the bride and groom figured out, between them, that the only way out of the ice was to walk around it in different directions and pretend it wasn't there. The wedding photo shows Eleanor smiling, Franklin smiling, the president towering over both of them. Look closer. The smile on Eleanor's face belongs to a girl who has decided, very early, that the safest way to survive a family is to become useful to it. The smile on Franklin's face belongs to a young man who has never been refused anything that mattered. Those two smiles walked into a marriage built on Sarah Delano Roosevelt's money, under the long shadow of Theodore Roosevelt's fame, on a day designed, almost from the first, to remind the bride that she was the least important person in the room. A century later, the room still belongs, in the public imagination, to the grinning president, the postage stamp, the fireside chat, the 4 terms, the funeral train. And tucked just behind him, half in shadow, the woman who made the whole machinery run, who carried his politics into rooms his legs could not enter, who answered the grief of strangers by the 1,000, and who outlived him by 17 years and spent every one of them turning a marriage designed to erase her into the foundation of a life the world is still trying to live up to. That life did not begin when Franklin went to the White House. It began on East 65th Street, in a townhouse with doors cut into every floor so that Sarah could walk into her son's home uninvited at any hour on any story. It began on St. Patrick's Day, 1905, when a shy, plain, large-toothed girl named Granny accepted a ring from a young man whose mother intended to own her whether she wore it or not. The marriage had not yet begun to fail. It had in some quiet way already been arranged to fail. The only question left was what the bride would do with the wreckage and how high she would climb on it. Sarah Delano Roosevelt did not need to raise her voice. She never once needed to scream at her daughter-in-law, never once needed to throw a dish across a dining room, never once needed to lose her composure in front of the servants. She held all the money. That was enough. In 1908, 3 years into the marriage, she gave the young couple a wedding gift that doubled as a cage. A pair of adjoining townhouses on East 65th Street in New York, 6 stories apiece, with doors cut through the connecting wall on every single floor. Sarah lived in one half, Franklin and Eleanor lived in the other. The doors meant Sarah could walk into her son's home uninvited at any hour of any day on any story, and she did. She walked in to inspect the linens, to comment on the menu, to rearrange the furniture, to hold the grandbabies, to remind Eleanor, gently and constantly, who paid for the walls around her. Eleanor loathed it. Decades later, when she set her memories down on paper, she described a home that never answered to her. A home decorated, furnished, staffed by the woman next door, who reserved the right to redo any of it on a whim. She could do nothing to alter a single thing inside those walls. The comfortable life the marriage was supposed to provide, the dignity of running your own kitchen, choosing your own curtains, hiring your own nurse, making your own mistakes, all of it evaporated the moment Sarah crossed the threshold. Eleanor swallowed it year after year, smiling at dinner parties she did not host in a house she did not own. 6 babies came between 1906 and 1916, and Sarah installed herself as the genuine authority of the nursery. She overruled Eleanor on nursing, on weaning, on schooling, on discipline, on bedtimes. She lavished money and toys on the children at a scale Eleanor's allowance could never hope to match. The grandchildren learned, very young, which word in the household carried weight. It was not their mother's. Years later, their eldest son, James, set it down in his memoir. His grandmother, he wrote, said to the children's faces what she said to their backs. "Your mother only bore you. I am more your mother than she is." That sentence did not need to be defended. Everyone in the family understood the arithmetic without a soul speaking it aloud. Cross Sarah, and the comfortable life disappeared. The townhouses, the servants, the governesses, the schools, the summers on Campobello, the wardrobe for the political dinners, all of it answered to one signature. Franklin's income, the family fortune, the houses, the staff, the future itself, all of it belonged to the woman in the next building. Eleanor learned in those years that nobody under that roof would protect her but herself. The lesson sank deep. It never came out. By the late 19-teens, Eleanor occupied a thin sliver of a life she might call her own. Franklin worked in Washington as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the post that wartime Washington offered to promising young Democrats with famous names. The family summered on Campobello Island, off the coast of Maine, in a cottage that Sarah had also, in her quiet way, arranged to control. Eleanor was drowning. Correspondence, social duty, 6 children, a household staff she did not hire, a mother-in-law she could not offend, and a husband whose attention had the drifting, distracted quality of a man with somewhere else on his mind. She hired herself a part-time social secretary to handle the flood of letters that a political wife was expected to answer by hand. The woman she hired was Lucy Mercer. Lucy was tall and warm and gorgeous, and she was broke. She came from a fallen Catholic family of the old sort, the kind that remembered silver and linens and ancestors, but could no longer pay the bills. She moved through the Roosevelt household the way certain people move through any household, with ease, with charm, with the gift of making everyone in the room feel briefly seen. She charmed the staff. She charmed Sarah. She charmed the children. She charmed, fatally and finally, the master of the house. Franklin and Lucy fell into an affair while Eleanor ran the nursery and the correspondence and the unglamorous machinery of a political wife's life. How long the affair ran, how far it reached, no historian alive can prove to this day. What blew it open was September of 1918. Franklin sailed home from a tour of the European front, where he had gone to inspect Navy installations in France and Britain. He was carried off the ship on a stretcher, half dead with double pneumonia and the influenza that was then burning across the world. Eleanor nursed him. She sat by his bed, sponged his forehead, wrote his letters, kept the household moving around the sick room. While she was unpacking his luggage, she found a packet of love letters bound together with a ribbon, written in a familiar hand. They were tender. They were unmistakable. They were from her own social secretary to her own husband. Eleanor told the story, decades later, to a friend and biographer named Joseph Lash. "The bottom dropped out of my own particular world," she said. Then Eleanor did the unthinkable for a wronged wife in the year 1918. She offered Franklin a divorce. She did it without theatrics, without scenes, without the flung accusations that the popular novels of the day imagined as a wife's only weapon. She put the option on the table and let him choose. In 1918, a divorce was not the small social inconvenience it later became. A divorced politician was a finished politician. A divorced mother of 5 was a woman exiled from the drawing rooms that still ran polite society. A divorced man whose name was Roosevelt, in a family that took its respectability as seriously as its money, would have been erased from public life before the ink dried on the papers. The marriage limped on, not because the love between them recovered. It limped on because 3 cold constraints pinned every party in place. Sarah loathed the word divorce and pinned the family's financial future to Franklin's obedience. Lucy, a devout Catholic, could not marry a divorced Protestant father of 5 without forfeiting her church and her family and her place in the only community that still claimed her. Franklin's political career, the one thing he wanted more than any woman alive, depended on the spotless image only Eleanor could guarantee. So they stayed married. Nobody in that arrangement chose love. They chose damage control. The romance lay dead on the floor. The partnership lay ahead. They stopped sharing a bed in 1918, and they never restarted. They did not, however, stop sharing a mission. For the next 27 years, 2 people who could no longer love each other discovered they could still use each other brilliantly. Eleanor walked out of that sick room a different woman. She had offered her husband his freedom and watched him choose his ambition over her. She had learned, in the worst possible way, that the only person in her marriage she could rely on was the one in the mirror. The wife she had been, the shy girl who smiled through dinner parties and other people's houses, was finished. The woman who replaced her would spend the rest of her life refusing to be wounded in the same place twice. The bargain they struck had no name. Nobody signed anything. The family simply absorbed it and moved on, the way families absorb a death they refuse to discuss. Lucy Mercer disappeared from the household, and for a long stretch, from the record. Sarah tightened her grip on the purse strings and on the grandchildren. Franklin returned to his Navy work, and soon enough, to his political plans. Eleanor buried the letters and the marriage and the love she had thought she had, and began, slowly and painfully, to build the woman she would become. 27 years is a long time to share a house with a man who no longer wants you in his bed. It is also a long time to share a mission with him. Eleanor would use every one of those years. The partnership that survived the letters of 1918 would, in the end, carry two people into the White House and into the history books, and the country would remember them as a love story. The country would be wrong. The country was looking at the surface. Underneath, two people who could not love each other had learned to work together with a cold efficiency that almost no couple in American public life has ever matched. They did it because they had to. They did it because the alternative was the ruin of everything Franklin wanted and the slow disappearance of everything Eleanor was beginning to want for herself. They did it because Sarah's money still hung over them, because Lucy's church still barred the door, because Franklin's career still needed the shine of a happy marriage, and because Eleanor, somewhere in the wreckage of September 1918, discovered that she was stronger than anyone in the family had ever guessed, including herself. The romance died in a packet of letters bound with a ribbon. The partnership began the morning after. In the summer of 1921, the marriage caught what looked, at first, like a catastrophe. The Roosevelt family was vacationing at Campobello Island, that rough, wind-bitten scrap of land off the coast of Maine, where the Canadians and the Americans argued politely about which country owned the fog. Franklin was 39, in the prime of his life, the legs that had carried him through sailing and golf and the long climb toward the White House, strong and capable. He went swimming in the cold bay water, came home with what seemed like a summer cold, ran a brutal fever, woke up one morning unable to move below the waist. Polio. The diagnosis came fast. The prognosis came slower and worse. The golden boy of the Roosevelt family, the man Sarah Delano Roosevelt had dressed in curls and treated as a small son orbiting her parlor, would never walk without steel and pain. He would spend the rest of his life refusing, in public, to admit how completely the disease had taken his body. Sarah saw her opening before the doctors finished their rounds. Her plan was simple and final, and exactly what she had always wanted. Bring Franklin home to Hyde Park. Tuck him into a wheelchair. Let him live out his days as a wealthy invalid gentleman who tended the estate and bothered no one. A comfortable retirement at 40. The end of the political story. The end of the dangerous ambition. The end of the wife who had, in Sarah's quiet arithmetic, taken too much of her son already. Sarah had lost the battle over the marriage in 1905 and won, instead, the daily life inside it. Now polio handed her the war. For the first time in 16 years of marriage, Eleanor planted her feet and fought her mother-in-law head-on. She had spent those 16 years absorbing insults, swallowing instructions, smiling through dinner parties in houses she could not call her own, raising children who answered to someone else. She had discovered, in the sick room of 1918, that nobody under that roof would protect her but herself. She had no intention of letting Sarah Delano Roosevelt turn her husband into a comfortable invalid and bury him in Hyde Park. Eleanor grasped something Sarah refused to see, something the doctors were still arguing about, something Franklin himself refused to accept. A man without ambition would rot. A man in a wheelchair without a reason to leave it would vanish. The marriage might be a cold instrument, but the partnership that survived the letters of 1918 still worked, and the partnership still had a country to climb. The recovery was brutal and slow. Franklin chased every cure money could buy. He hauled himself across floors on his arms. He lowered himself, with help, into the warm mineral waters of a swimming pool in Georgia, where the buoyant heat let his legs move in ways the air would not. He submitted to months of therapy in a desperate, angry, private war against his own body. He wore, for the rest of his life, 10 pounds of steel braces locked onto his legs, and he wore them only when no outsider could see him stand. The public image of Franklin Roosevelt, even in the worst years of the Depression, even when he hauled himself up the railing of a railway car to address the crowds, never included the braces. That was part of the partnership Eleanor helped him build. The legs he could not use had to disappear. The man who used them had to seem, somehow, whole. Eleanor planted herself at the center of that fight, not as a nurse fussing over an invalid, but as the strategist who refused to let Sarah win. She traveled, she organized, she learned to deliver speeches in a high nervous voice she had to train herself to steady, carrying her husband's politics into rooms his wheelchair could not enter. She shoved him back into the arena. She kept his name alive in Democratic politics while he recovered. She built her own network of reformers, organizers, journalists, and party fixers, the kind of people who could put a name in front of the right voters at the right moment. She put her own legs, her own eyes, her own ears to work in places a man in a wheelchair could never reach. The cruelest irony of the whole arrangement sat down and refused to move. The marriage that had starved Eleanor of love had finally given her a reason to grow powerful, and she took it with both hands. A different woman climbed into public view, and she did not climb quietly. Eleanor joined the Women's Trade Union League, the organization that tried to organize women into the labor movement at a time when most unions would not have them. She joined the League of Women Voters, the body that tried to push the new female electorate into actual exercise of the franchise. She joined the women's division of the state Democratic Party, where the women of the organization sat, officially, in a separate box from the men and were expected to smile and pour coffee. Eleanor refused the box. She edited a newsletter. She ran a furniture factory at Hyde Park, employing local craftsmen who had no other work in the hard years after the war. She co-founded a girls' school in New York City and taught teenagers literature and current events between political errands. None of these activities belonged to the world Sarah Delano Roosevelt had prepared her daughter-in-law to inhabit. All of them belonged to the world Eleanor was building for herself, one piece at a time, out of the wreckage of the marriage. Franklin's allies noticed what his mother never admitted. The shy, plain, large-toothed orphan, the girl they had nicknamed Granny to her face, the woman who had walked into the family starving for approval, had become one of the sharpest political operators in the state of New York. She walked wards and hospitals. She visited settlement houses. She sat in smoky rooms with labor organizers who distrusted her class and won them over anyway. She reported back to Franklin the things the smiling crowds would never tell him, the grievances and the grumbles and the small local disasters that turned a winning candidate into a loser overnight. The partnership ran like a machine, and Eleanor had become, by force of will and by the accidents of history, half the engine. In 1928, the machine delivered. Franklin won the governorship of New York. He won it the way he would win everything from then on, with charm and a great smile and the appearance of effortless command. While behind him, Eleanor walked the wards, smoothed the rumors, kept the Democratic factions in line, and fed her husband the unvarnished truth that his aides were too polite to deliver. The partnership had a title now, and an office in Albany, and a future that pointed, almost visibly, at a much bigger house in a much bigger city. Sarah Delano Roosevelt watched it all from Hyde Park, with the uneasy expression of a woman who had lost the battle she did not remember conceding. The marriage had been designed to erase Eleanor. Polio, the catastrophe that nearly killed Franklin's career, gave Eleanor the only thing the marriage had refused to give her: a purpose, a stage, a pair of legs to stand on while her husband learned to fake his. The woman who walked out of the Campobello cottage in 1921 was not the woman who had walked in. The woman who walked out had begun to understand, in the marrow of her bones, that the only life she would ever live was the one she built for herself with her own two hands. Sarah's plan, the wheelchair and the estate and the comfortable silence of Hyde Park, had almost worked. A weaker daughter-in-law would have accepted it. A more frightened woman would have packed the bags and surrendered her husband to his mother, and the household would have settled into the long, drowsy retirement Sarah had imagined. Eleanor Roosevelt refused. She refused because she had been refused everything else in that family since the day she said yes at the altar on St. Patrick's Day. The disease that broke Franklin's legs did something to Eleanor that no cruelty in the marriage had yet managed. It gave her permission. Permission to speak. Permission to travel. Permission to walk into rooms full of labor organizers and politicians and reporters and not ask anyone's leave. Permission, at last, to be the loudest person in the room, since the loudest person in the room was no longer physically able to do the job alone. The governorship of New York was the first stop on the road that ended in the White House. The wheelchair did not appear in any photograph of that campaign. The steel braces did not appear in any photograph of that campaign. The woman who had once been too shy to enter a room without her uncle the president at her side appeared in every photograph. And she was not smiling the old smile. She was smiling a different smile, the smile of a woman who has finally understood exactly what she is for. By the 1930s, Eleanor Roosevelt had stopped waiting for Franklin to love her and started finding love somewhere else. The marriage still functioned. The partnership still ran like the machine the polio years had built. The country still saw, when it bothered to look, the famous couple holding America steady through the worst economic collapse in its history. Underneath, two households had begun to form under the same roof, separated by a wall of ice the public never learned to see. The most intense bond of Eleanor's new life belonged to a woman named Lorena Hickok. The press called her Hick. Everybody who knew her called her Hick. She was a journalist, a chain smoker, a hard drinker, and, by the standards of her own time and her own profession, an open secret. She had been an Associated Press reporter, one of the best in the country, assigned in the late 1920s to cover the wife of the governor of New York. Hick broke every rule of her profession by falling for her subject, and the feeling ran both directions, hard and fast and without apology. The two women exchanged more than 3,000 letters across the years they were closest. The ones that survived do not read like polite friendship. In March of 1933, days into Franklin's presidency, Eleanor sent Hick a line that has fueled 100 academic arguments since. She ached to wrap her arms around her and kiss her at the corner of her mouth. Historians split on what those letters mean. Blanche Wiesen Cook, who wrote the most ambitious biography of Eleanor, and Susan Quinn, who wrote the most ambitious biography of Hick, read the correspondence as the record of a physical romance between two women in love. The older guard files the same pages under passionate Victorian friendship and leaves the bedroom door politely shut. The documents allow both readings. The label matters less than the fact buried underneath it. Deep inside a marriage that had frozen her out for 15 years, Eleanor had found a person who wanted every part of her. She moved Hick into the White House. She rerouted her own travels to steal hours alone. She wrote the letters in the small hours of the morning when Franklin slept, and the children slept, and the country slept. For a woman raised to expect nothing from anybody, that counted for more than any footnote in any history book. The relationship cost Hick everything that mattered professionally. She quit the Associated Press because she could no longer pretend to cover the woman she loved with a straight face. She spent years orbiting the Roosevelt world, never quite inside it, watching Eleanor's expanding public life pull her further and further away. The romance cooled, eventually, into a long and complicated friendship that lasted until Eleanor died. Hick kept the letters. Decades after her own death, the letters surfaced and rewrote everything the public thought it knew about the loneliest First Lady in American history. Eleanor also built a refuge Sarah Delano Roosevelt could not touch. Its name was Valkill, a stone cottage 2 miles from the big house at Hyde Park. The cottage had been a workshop once. Eleanor and a circle of women friends, several of them couples, some of them friends from the women's organizations she had thrown herself into after polio, turned it into the first home that answered to her and to her alone. Franklin teased her about it. He called it the honeymoon cottage and missed the point entirely. For the first time since 1905, Eleanor slept under a roof nobody could redecorate over her head. She slept under it surrounded by people who had chosen her on purpose, and the choice meant more to her than the man who had married her ever guessed. While Eleanor built a life outside the marriage, Franklin built one inside it, and staffed it with women who supplied the easy warmth his wife no longer offered. First among them was Marguerite LaHand, whom the whole White House called Missy. For 2 decades, Missy lived under his roof. She ran his calendar. She poured his evening cocktails. She played hostess at the loose, laughing gatherings Franklin adored and Eleanor could barely tolerate. Missy worshipped Franklin. She organized her entire existence around him. She filled the role of devoted companion that Eleanor had vacated years earlier and never intended to reclaim. Whether Missy and Franklin crossed into the bedroom, biographers cannot prove. Scholars like Catherine Smith, who wrote the book on Missy, turn up no hard evidence of a physical affair. What no historian disputes is the emotional shape of the arrangement. Missy gave Franklin what Franklin wanted most: adoration without challenge, company without argument, a household where the laughter came easy and the drinks came often, and the conversation did not require him to defend any position he had not already decided to hold. Eleanor could not give him that. Eleanor never could. The president kept a wife who challenged him and a secretary who adored him, and let the two arrangements run side by side under the same roof without apology, the way a man keeps two fishing rods and uses whichever suits the weather. The strangest casualty of the arrangement was not the marriage, it was the children. They had spent their childhood shuttling between two parents fighting a war so quiet that most outsiders never noticed it. Franklin hated conflict the way some men hate the dentist. He refused to discipline the children. He refused to have the hard conversations with his wife. He refused every confrontation he could possibly dodge, and he surrounded himself with people who kept things light. Eleanor could not keep things light. She arrived at dinner armed with causes and statistics and the suffering of sharecroppers and miners and the unemployed, and she pressed her husband on all of it, while he only wanted a drink and a laugh. The children grew up in the gap between those two parents, and the gap was wide, and the children learned, in their different ways, to survive it. In December of 1943, the family fault line cracked wide open. Anna, the eldest daughter, moved into the White House. Franklin adored Anna. She brought the lightness he craved. She mixed the drinks. She kept the conversation easy. She slid naturally into the hostess chair her mother kept refusing to fill. Eleanor watched her own daughter become the companion she herself could not be. The cocktail hour curdled into a daily reminder of everything broken in the marriage. Eleanor often skipped it. When she did show up, she sat in stony silence while the laughter carried on around her, and the laughter belonged to her husband and her daughter and the pretty secretary who poured the drinks, and the silence belonged to her, and she sat in it the way she had learned to sit in every cold room Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt had ever built around her. Two parallel households ran under one roof, and the White House staff learned to navigate both. Eleanor had Valkill and the women's organizations, and the long road trips through coal country and bread lines, where she shook hands with the people her husband's speeches tried to reach. Franklin had Missy and Anna and the cocktail hour and the easy company of men who liked their president charming and unbothered. The marriage had stopped being a battlefield. It had become a holding pattern, the kind two airplanes fly while they wait for clearance to land, neither one willing to climb out of the way of the other. The arrangement would not last forever. Nothing Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt had ever built had outlasted Eleanor's refusal to stay inside it. The connecting doors on East 65th Street had not stopped Eleanor. The letters of 1918 had not stopped her. The polio and the wheelchair and the mother-in-law's plan for a quiet retirement in Hyde Park had not stopped her. Two parallel households under one roof would not stop her either. She had her refuge. She had her women. She had her work. And the work was about to take her to a place nobody in the family could follow her out of. The most famous marriage in America had become, by the early 1940s, a business arrangement with a cocktail hour attached. The country still saw the postage stamp. Eleanor saw the silent chair at the dinner table. The country saw a first lady who held her husband's hand in public. Eleanor saw a daughter mixing drinks in the hostess chair she had refused to fill. The country saw love. Eleanor saw the long arithmetic of a partnership that had run out of love and kept running on purpose. And she had stopped pretending, long before, that the arithmetic was anything other than what it was. On April 12, 1945, the most public marriage in America ended in a rented cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia. Warm Springs was the little retreat Franklin had built for himself in the pine woods of the state, the place where the warm mineral water eased the legs polio had wrecked, the place he loved most in the world, the place he escaped to when the presidency pressed too hard. He had been there many times. The staff knew his habits. The cottage was small and easy to defend against the curious. He sat for a portrait that afternoon. The painter was Elizabeth Shumatoff, working on a canvas of the president at ease. He looked, the small circle around him agreed, more comfortable in his body that spring than he had in months. The war in Europe was winding toward victory. The country was tired and hopeful. Franklin chatted easily with the cousins who had come to keep him company, Margaret Suckley and Laura Delano, and with the artist, and with the people who had learned, over 4 terms, to make his working days feel lighter than they were. In the chair closest to the president sat Lucy Mercer Rutherford. 27 years after Eleanor found those letters in his suitcase, Lucy sat at Franklin's side as he died. Mid-afternoon, the president complained of a sharp pain in the back of his head. He slumped forward. Cerebral hemorrhage. He never regained consciousness. By the time the doctors finished their work, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead, and Lucy Mercer Rutherford was being quietly hustled out of the house and driven away, because everyone in that room understood exactly what her presence meant, and exactly who could never be allowed to know. Eleanor learned of her husband's death in Washington and flew through the night to Georgia. She was 60 years old, a widow at 60, in the worst hours of her life, in a state hundreds of miles from her home, in a house that had never been hers, and the marriage she had rebuilt into a partnership had ended in a chair she had not occupied, beside a woman whose letters she had found in a suitcase a lifetime ago. She arrived to find the body of the man she had used brilliantly and been used by in return, and she performed the role of devoted widow with a control bordering on superhuman. Then the knife turned one final time. Laura Delano, the cousin who had been at the cottage, told Eleanor the news she had not seen coming. Lucy Mercer had not only been present at the end. Lucy had been visiting Warm Springs before, more than once. She had become, in the last chapter of Franklin's life, a regular guest. She had been welcomed back into the orbit of the most powerful man in the world, and someone inside the family had arranged it. That someone was Anna, their eldest daughter, the same daughter who had moved into the White House and charmed the cocktail hour and slipped into the hostess chair Eleanor would not fill. Anna had personally set up the visits. Anna had invited Lucy to White House dinners whenever her mother traveled. Anna had spent the last years of her father's life restoring to him the company of the woman Eleanor had discovered in his luggage a generation earlier, and she had done it behind Eleanor's back, with a secrecy that cut deeper than the infidelity itself. The betrayal did not come only from a dead husband and a long-ago mistress. It came from her own child, the woman who had taught her, by example, that the only person in the family worth trusting was the one in the mirror, now discovered that even her daughter had not been on her side. The marriage had frozen her out. The cocktail hour had frozen her out. The wheelchair had given her a job that consumed her. Now the job was over, the man was dead, and the daughter had chosen the dead man's comfort over her mother's dignity. Eleanor refused to collapse. She refused to burn the house down. She refused to sell her story to the newspapers that would have paid any price for the details. She refused to let the country glimpse a single crack in the widow they had been asked to mourn. She rode the train back to Washington beside her husband's coffin. She stood guard over the body while a grieving nation wept for the man she no longer trusted. She performed the role of devoted widow through the funeral, through the burial at Hyde Park, through the long days of public grief that followed, and the performance was so complete, so disciplined, so perfectly controlled, that the country never knew there was anything to perform. Privately, the fallout landed on Anna. Mother and daughter fell into a bitter estrangement that dragged on for a long stretch. The wound from Warm Springs never fully healed, though they eventually found their way back to each other, the way families do when the alternative is worse than the wound. Eleanor forgave a great deal in her life. She had forgiven Franklin for 1918. She had forgiven Sarah for East 65th Street. She had forgiven a country that did not yet know how to value the work she did for it. This one took her years. A daughter who arranged the return of the mistress was a different category of betrayal. Eleanor understood the difference, and Anna learned, slowly, that she had crossed a line her mother could not unsee. The textbooks cast the marriage as backdrop, and the public life as achievement. Both grew from a single root. The woman who chaired the commission behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The woman who walked coal mines and bread lines and sat on picket lines with strikers. The woman who answered the letters of strangers by the thousand, who weighed in on juvenile delinquency and the hydrogen bomb in a newspaper column 6 days a week. The woman who marched for civil rights and needled presidents of both parties well into her 70s and met Khrushchev and outlived every figure in the long drama of her marriage. She quarried every ounce of that strength inside the marriage built to deny her any. The widow did not retire. President Truman appointed her to the United Nations within months of Franklin's death. She spent the next 3 years out-arguing Soviet diplomats line by line in a committee room in New York until the General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights without a single dissenting vote. The year was 1948. The document she pushed through anchored the modern human rights movement and has since been translated into more languages than any document on earth except the Bible. Diplomats gave her a nickname that captured the scope of what she had become. They called her the First Lady of the World. She kept writing her newspaper column 6 days a week, a habit she had started in 1935, answering readers on everything from juvenile delinquency to the hydrogen bomb. She crossed oceans. She met Khrushchev. She marched for civil rights. She needled presidents of both parties well into her 70s. She outlived Sarah, who had tried to bury her son in Hyde Park and had lost that war the way she had lost the war over the marriage. She outlived Missy, who had poured Franklin's cocktails and filled the hostess chair and never quite filled the role Eleanor had refused to fill. She outlived Anna's estrangement, the way she outlived most of the griefs the family handed her by refusing to let the grief become the final word. She outlived Franklin by 17 years. 17 years is a long time to build a second life out of the wreckage of the first. She spent those years doing what she had learned to do inside the marriage, except now the partnership was hers alone. She picked the causes. She set the pace. She answered to no one in a household that belonged to her, surrounded by women friends who had chosen her on purpose, working in rooms her mother-in-law could not walk into through any connecting door. Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt had cut connecting doors into every floor of the townhouse on East 65th Street, so she could walk into her son's marriage whenever the mood struck her. For 40 years, nobody alive could stop her. The doors were the original sin of the marriage, the architectural expression of Sarah's refusal to let her son belong to anyone but herself. Eleanor found the exit those doors implied and used them to leave. The marriage set out to erase her. It built her instead. The country forgot, for a long time, that the woman on the postage stamp and the woman behind the man on the postage stamp had traveled such different roads to arrive in the same frame. The country is still catching up. The declaration she pushed through the United Nations in 1948 is still being translated into new languages and argued over in new courtrooms and carried into new protests by people who never learned her maiden name and do not need to. The work she did inside the marriage, the work of holding the partnership together when the love had rotted out of it, prepared her for a larger partnership the country could not have imagined on the St. Patrick's Day she walked into the church on her uncle's arm. A shy, plain girl named Granny, marrying a young man whose mother intended to own her whether she wore the ring or not. She wore the ring. She raised the children Sarah claimed. She carried the politics Franklin could no longer carry alone. She outlived the marriage by 17 years and turned every one of those years into a quiet argument that the women the family tried to erase are the women the world cannot do without. That is the part of the story the textbooks have not yet learned how to print.